The sound of boots crunching over gravel echoed between the barracks as the gray sky hung low over the camp, pressing down like a second weight upon the prisoner's shoulders. Guido kept his head down, his arm around Josu, who was too tired to ask more questions. The boy's eyes scanned the barbed wire fences, the armed guards, the skeletal faces of the others trudging past. Yet in his mind he still clung to his father's words. The game, the points, the promise of a tank. His father's voice, warm and playful even now, stayed nestled in his ear like a lullaby against the cold. But something inside Guido was beginning to fray. The nights had grown colder, and the Nazis, crueler. The rules of the game had taken more imagination than ever to uphold. Josu had grown suspicious when they'd gone without food 2 days in a row. Guido's humor had become thinner, sometimes cracking mid-joke, like an icicle breaking under its own weight. Still, he smiled. Still, he made silly faces when the guards weren't looking. Still, he sang softly to lull his son to sleep. One night, after smuggling a crust of bread into their sleeping quarters and pretending it was the menu item from a fine restaurant, Guido heard whispering near the latrines. He paused, listened, then crept closer under the cover of darkness. He recognized the man. Ezra, an older Polish professor who used to teach violin at a conservatory in Krakow. Guido had once brought him a bowl of soup. After noticing the man had fainted during roll call, Ezra saw him, his eyes hard at first, then softening when he recognized the clownish waiter, who always had a joke ready. The professor beckoned him over, made a gesture to keep quiet, and spoke in broken Italian. There was something happening beneath the surface of the camp. Something dangerous and impossible and desperate. A network. A thread of defiance, buried deep beneath the boots and rifles and ash. It was barely more than a whisper. A movement of names passed hand to hand, hope flickering like candlelight in the storm. Guido said nothing. Not then. But that night, he didn't sleep. He watched Josu's small chest rise and fall. Curled beside him in the corner, he thought of Dora, wherever she was in the women's section. Imagined her eyes locked on the horizon just as his were now. He remembered the day he met her. The egg he made her laugh with. The opera music. The umbrella. He remembered stealing her from the train platform. From her stiff fiancé. From the predictable life laid out before her. He had rewritten the rules. Before, perhaps he could do so again. The next evening, after smuggling Josu into a forgotten broom closet during the labor period and telling him the game masters were checking the leaderboard, Guido returned to Ezra and asked to be part of the resistance. The professor hesitated. He looked at Guido, his clothes thin and torn, his hands calloused, his posture slouched from months of servitude. Then he saw the eyes. Alive, not beaten. Not yet. Ezra leaned in close and began to teach him. The resistance in the camp was unlike any resistance outside. Here, weapons were ideas. Sabotage was a whisper. Survival itself was rebellion. There were prisoners who'd managed to reroute certain supply deliveries. Others who tampered with tools used by the Germans. A few had even falsified records to save lives, swapping prisoner numbers in ledgers, hiding the sick from inspection rounds, risking everything for a moment more of light. Guido became their jester, their runner, their ghost. No one suspected. The Italian clown, who always talked to himself in nonsensical riddles, and sang lullabies to the air. Underneath the barracks, in the crawl spaces and storage rooms the guards never bothered to inspect, Guido found a new rhythm. Messages were slipped to him in bar soap. Names were passed beneath the bread in the soup line. Once, he distracted an SS guard with a prank, just long enough for a smuggled blanket to be passed to a dying man. Another time, he organized a mock opera performance for the prisoners, complete with imaginary instruments and exaggerated flourishes, while Ezra used the commotion to extract 2 men from a scheduled transport. But always, there was Josu. Guido never let the resistance touch his son. The game stayed alive for him, now more important than ever. It became harder each day, especially after he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in a shard of broken glass, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, hair matted and streaked with soot. Still, when he saw Josu, he smiled. Still, he performed. He juggled rocks, made hats out of potato sacks, pretended the guard dogs were contestants in a dog show. In time, Guido was asked to take on something greater. The resistance had intercepted whispers of a planned extermination. A sweep of the entire section where Guido and Josu slept. Too many mouths, too little food. The Nazis were going to thin the ranks. Ezra had a plan. There was a storage truck that arrived weekly, bringing uniforms, cigarettes, sometimes even medical supplies. The plan was mad. They would hijack it, not to escape, but to use it, redirect it, hide prisoners inside, and smuggle them to the lumberyard on the outskirts of the camp, where an abandoned tunnel system lay sealed and forgotten. The night before the operation, Guido held Josu tighter than usual. The boy asked him what level of the game they were on. Guido told him it was the final round, the one where only the smartest, quietest, bravest children could win. The tank was so close, he whispered, he could almost hear its engine. Josu nodded, sleepy but smiling, and asked if Mama would see the tank too. Guido nodded. He kissed his son's forehead, then he stepped into the dark. The operation began at dawn. Guido, and 2 others, disguised in stolen overcoats, crept through the shadows to where the truck was parked near the southern fence. It was riskier than expected. A patrol changed its route. One of the guards decided to take a cigarette break, 5 meters from their hiding place. Guido's heart pounded like a drum inside his chest. But then, in a moment of absurd chance that seemed written by fate, a crate of canned goods fell from the back of a passing vehicle, drawing the guards' attention just long enough for the 3 men to slip inside. Inside the truck, darkness, breath held, muscles cramped, the smell of rust and mold. Then movement. Then the crunch of gravel as the truck began to move. They had done it. They were inside. They had minutes to act. Guido climbed over crates, reached the front, found the lockbox under the dash, just as Ezra had described. He retrieved the false manifest, scribbled with an SS signature, and placed it in the driver's folder. If the checkpoint guard glanced too quickly, it would look official. The truck lurched forward again. Time was peeling away, dotted the lumberyard. Prisoners were waiting, haggard, gaunt, terrified. Guido jumped out first, waved a signal. They loaded 8 people into the back, hiding them under sacks and scrap wood. Guido stayed behind, his job incomplete. The next phase had begun. They had done the unthinkable, defied death. But the retaliation came swift and brutal. 2 days later, the guards discovered one of the tunnels. A child had left behind a scrap of cloth. The camp was locked down. Roll calls extended to hours. Men were dragged into the mud and beaten without reason. Guido's name appeared on a list. So did Ezra's. So did many others. Guido knew what it meant. Execution, reprisal. There would be made examples. But there was still a thread of hope. Ezra passed him a message during the final roll call. A plan. Josu was to be hidden, one last time, in the metal locker behind the laundry. He would stay there, silent, until one of the resistance members still free came for him. Guido nodded. He knew what he had to do. He danced that night. Danced like a fool in the courtyard. As the guards lined up the condemned, he made them laugh. He juggled rocks. He pretended his boots were glued to the earth, and then flailed when he broke free. Josu watched from the edge of the barracks, not understanding, laughing despite himself. Then Guido was gone, but not dead. Ezra had switched the ledgers one final time. Another name, another number. The body burned was not Guido's. He was alive, hidden beneath the floorboards of the infirmary, sustained by soup smuggled by nurses who remembered his kindness. The war ended 6 days later. The Allies arrived. The camp was liberated. Prisoners flooded the gates, blinking into sunlight, collapsing into snow and ash and tears. A tank rolled in through the smoke, and Josu saw it. He stood in the center of the yard, thin and wide-eyed, and when the soldier pulled him up and placed him on the hatch, the boy smiled. He had won. He looked around for his father, but he was nowhere to be seen. Yet. Later, when the prisoners were lined up for transport to recovery camps, when the Red Cross nurses handed out water and clean blankets, when Dora came running barefoot from the women's barracks with her hair unbraided and her heart bursting, Guido appeared, dressed in a stolen coat, one hand clutching a violin he had found in the rubble. He walked straight to them. Josu screamed, and this time, the game was truly over, but the laughter had saved them, and the resistance had won. There were things that could not be reclaimed. Names spoken once, and then never again, like Ezra's, whose coat had been found by the furnace door the day before the Allies arrived. Guido had asked and asked, but the silence was louder than any answer. The professor had smiled. The night they switched the ledgers, a quiet nod of farewell in the dark. His final words had been an unfinished sentence in Polish, but the look in his eyes had said everything. Guido would live. The child would live. And that meant something. That meant the nightmare hadn't swallowed everything. After the liberation, The Americans herded the survivors gently, but firmly toward trucks and tents, sorting them like fragile artifacts, whispering instructions in languages many didn't understand. Guido stayed close to Josu and Dora, keeping his arm around both of them, as if they might float away otherwise. The boy still laughed when his father made faces, but the laughter had a pause now, a hesitation, like something had grown too old too fast in his chest. The camp smelled like rust and rot and smoke. Even after the fire stopped, even after the guards had vanished into the trees like cowardly ghosts, the smell lingered. Guido never let Josu see him cry, but once, as they rode in the back of a transport truck beside a soldier who gave them each a half-eaten chocolate bar, he turned his face to the canvas wall and wept silently, his shoulders shaking in a rhythm no joke could interrupt. They were taken to a recovery center in the French countryside, a former school converted into a refugee shelter, where rows of mattresses lined the gymnasium floor and children colored with chalk on the walls. Josu drew tanks. Dora, always elegant even in dust-covered rags, volunteered in the makeshift kitchen. Guido wandered at night, restless, looking for something to do, someone to help, some version of his old life to step into. But the restaurant was gone. The books, the bright red carpet, the daily theater of bread baskets and wine lists. His tuxedo had been burned long ago, and with it, the version of himself that had danced through the world with mischief in his eyes. Still, something lingered, a seed. One evening, as the sun turned the horizon violet, Guido set up 3 overturned buckets in the courtyard, stood on one, and began to juggle apples borrowed from the mess hall. A girl clapped, then a boy, then others gathered. When one of the apples fell, he made a great show of accusing the air of sabotage, interrogating invisible culprits, pretending to faint from the betrayal. The children laughed. Dora watched from the window, her hand pressed to her heart. By the following week, Guido had become the unofficial morale officer of the camp. Every morning, he told a new story, one more absurd than the last. About a giraffe who had tried to join the army. About a trumpet that could only play opera. About a group of Italian magicians who had turned Hitler into a chicken. The adults chuckled, but the children roared. Josu helped him now, sometimes passing him props, or correcting his father's increasingly silly Italian with the stern face of a game show host. The child who had once crouched in metal lockers to survive now stood proudly in front of others, delivering punchlines with the timing of a master. But laughter did not erase pain. Some nights, Guido would wake gasping, tangled in the thin sheets, his hands reaching for something that wasn't there. Sometimes he saw fire, sometimes faces, sometimes Ezra, holding a violin and mouthing something over and over. Guido would lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, his heart hammering like the shoes of the guards once had. He wasn't the only one. There were others in the camp, who had survived because of the resistance. A man named Samuel, who had hidden for 3 months beneath a pile of lumber, emerged to find that his wife and daughter had made it out thanks to the forged work detail lists. The resistance had smuggled into the German office. A woman named Marta had escaped execution, because the guard who was supposed to bring her to the lineup tripped on a soap-covered floor. An act of sabotage Guido had engineered with a sly wink and a discarded bardot. They began to find one another. In the evenings, when the tents cooled and the nurses stopped making rounds, survivors of resistance, of miracles, of near-impossible chances. And slowly, a plan began to form. The war was ending, but there were still camps that hadn't been liberated. There were still prisoners in hiding. And worse, there were still officers slipping away under false identities, leaving trails of ash behind them. Guido proposed something absurd, something that at first sounded like a joke. They would form a troupe, a traveling theater company. They would go town to town, playing music in pantomime and opera, but beneath it all, they would gather names, find people, track whispers, help those still left behind. No one took him seriously at first, until he sang. It was the same aria he had broadcasted once, long ago, through the loudspeakers of the camp, in an act of mad defiance, a moment that had reached Dora's ears like a beacon. He sang it in the courtyard, untrained and raw, with a voice full of cracks and wounds and truth. When he finished, the silence was deeper than applause. They began to train the next day. Costumes were sewn from bed linens, masks carved from scavenged wood, instruments borrowed or rebuilt, scripts written on napkins, then memorized by candlelight. Dora helped choreograph scenes. Josu designed a logo, a tank with wings. They called themselves Glee Invisibili. traveled first to nearby villages, playing in barns and schoolhouses. Children came for the clowns. Adults came for the rumors. After the show, Guido would shake hands and listen. Always listening. In Marseille, a woman slipped him a name. In Lyon, a priest offered a photograph. In Strasbourg, a baker wept as he told them about a niece who'd vanished the month before liberation. The troupe kept moving. They found survivors in basements and cellars, helped reunite families by sending coded letters hidden inside puppet props. They worked with Allied officers in secret, feeding them intelligence disguised in theater scripts. Guido never stopped performing, even as his hair thinned and his voice grew hoarse. He never missed a show. Years passed. The war became a memory for some, a nightmare for others. Trials were held. Monuments were built. History tried to find a way to explain what could not be explained. But glee and visibility continued. Smaller now, older, but just as fierce. One winter, in a snow-covered village near the German border, Guido sat beside a fireplace with a group of children, asking about the game. He told them it was real, that it had rules, and levels, and prizes. But the real prize, he said, was remembering. Remembering the people who never stopped fighting, even if they never raised a fist. Remembering that humor could be armor, and love a map. He looked at Josu, now a teenager, tall and clever, and still quick to laugh. The boy smiled at him, then looked away shyly. The tank had long since rusted in some museum, but the story of it still traveled. One evening, after a performance in Rome, a woman approached. She wore a red scarf and walked with a limp. She said her name was Anna. She remembered Ezra. She had been in the Krakow Conservatory before the war. She said she had a recording, an old vinyl disc, nearly cracked, but salvageable. She handed it to Guido without a word. That night, in a quiet hall, lit only by candlelight, Guido listened as the scratchy, weather-worn notes of a violin filled the air. It was rough, off-key in places, but he recognized the song, the one Ezra had played the night he taught Guido the names of the resistance members. The last piece he had taught his students before the Germans arrived. Guido did not weep. He smiled. He stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the curtain. The show was about to begin. The recording played again the next morning, faint and scratchy through the salvaged gramophone, and even though the notes stumbled in places, every person in the building recognized something eternal within it. Children stopped their games. Parents paused their conversations, and the elderly closed their eyes and swayed ever so slightly, as though the sound unlocked a doorway within their bones. It was not just music, it was proof of who they had been, of what they had carried, and what they still bore. Guido stood beside the machine, his eyes moist, his hands trembling not from sorrow but from the overwhelming weight of confirmation. Ezra had lived through him. The resistance had not been just a flutter in the dark. It had echoed. It had found ears. Years passed again. The troupe evolved. Some of the original members drifted away, settling into quiet lives with families and bakeries and classrooms, haunted but whole. New ones joined. A young Hungarian girl named Ilona, who could play the accordion with startling speed. A British Jewish writer who translated their performances into 5 languages. A mime who had escaped Dachau and could convey more with silence than Guido had ever thought possible. They no longer called themselves only performers. They were messengers. Their acts grew bolder. They reenacted stories from the camps not directly, but in metaphor, in stylized pantomime, in songs where the meaning lay between the lines. Their audience knew. The children often didn't. Not at first. But as those children grew, they remembered. The laughter carved itself into their memories as a question mark. One they would one day turn into understanding. Josu became their archivist at first. It had been just sketches, and props, and notes tucked in the corners of his backpack. Then it became interviews, voice recordings, diaries of survivors written in smudged ink on brittle paper. He traveled alone, sometimes, under his own name. He found one of Ezra's nephews in Tel Aviv, who gave him a lock of hair and a faded photograph showing the professor as a boy holding a violin twice his size. Josu created a map on the wall of the troupe's central meeting space. Red pins marked the places where they had performed, blue ones the places where they had found pieces of the resistance's legacy. The wall became a spiderweb of memory, stretching across Europe. One day, in a small mountain village on the Swiss border, they met a woman named Carolina, who had been a radio operator in the Polish forest resistance. She recognized Guido at once, not for his face, but for his laugh. She said she had once heard it crackle over a stolen Nazi frequency, during a night when all seemed lost. When snow had collapsed a passage tunnel and 3 of her units were trapped. In the silence that followed their cries, someone had activated an open channel. What came through was not a call for help, but a voice telling a joke about an invisible kangaroo who had won a bicycle race. It made no sense. It wasn't even funny, but it made her laugh until her ribs ached. And then she dug harder. Guido had no memory of such a broadcast. Perhaps it was real. Perhaps it was a myth woven into truth by need. He did not argue. He only bowed, took her hand, and invited her to see that evening's performance. Dora, too, found her place again. In the beginning, she had lived quietly, almost invisible, her trauma still pulsing too vividly for words. But over time, she found her voice in design, creating costumes from donated cloth, painting sets with rich strokes of passion and sorrow. She painted a new curtain for the troupe, this one showing a single red balloon tied to a tank turret. It became their emblem, stitched onto sleeves, printed on posters, and sometimes left in chalk outside bombed synagogues, as a sign that Glee Invisibili had passed through. But the world was changing. A new generation was growing up, one that did not feel the sting of occupation, who saw the camps in grainy textbooks and could not smell the ash that once clung to every corner of the sky. Some of their performances began to be met with confusion. A few were banned. In a Bavarian town where an old SS officer had been elected mayor, their arrival sparked protests. People called them provocateurs, said they were reopening wounds, better left closed. Guido answered with the same thing he had always done. He laughed. And then he told a story about a man who painted ghosts into buildings because he wanted the world to remember what it had tried to forget. Josu, now in his 20s, took it harder. He argued. He wrote letters. He challenged officials. He wanted to fight back in ways his father never had. He didn't understand how Guido could smile at men who tried to erase truth. One night, after a long rehearsal in a dusty hall, he shouted at his father, asking why he always had to be the clown, why he couldn't be angry, why he couldn't make the world look harder at its own guilt. Guido didn't answer immediately. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by costume trunks and paint cans, and looked at his son for a long time. Then he told him the story of the last night in the camp, the one Josu had never truly heard, the one with the truck, the smuggling, the moment when laughter had bought 6 more lives, and the moment when Guido had walked willingly toward a fate he believed would end him. He explained that sometimes anger could destroy a person faster than bullets, that sometimes the only weapon left to the weak was to remain human in a place where that word had no meaning. Josu cried that night, not with the rage of youth, but with the quiet, shuddering grief of someone finally understanding the cost of love. It was years later, in Rome, when the troupe held what would be their final performance. Guido's body was no longer agile. His knees creaked when he danced, and he had to pause between acts to catch his breath. Dora stood in the wings, her hair silver now, her hands still, paint-stained from the afternoon's last brushstrokes. Josu directed the lights, giving quiet nods to the team, now made of new faces. New believers. The crowd was large. Students, artists, journalists, survivors in wheelchairs with numbers still etched into their arms. Guido stepped onto the stage alone for the opening, wearing a bowler hat and a suit 2 sizes too large. He bowed deeply, his back creaking like old wood. And then, with the voice of a man who had held his sanity in his hands and decided to use it as a shield, he told one last story. It was about a boy who had once thought the world was a game, about how his father had made the rules up as they went along, not to lie, but to give him something to hold on to, something that wasn't horror, something that made the world just survivable enough. It was about how the boy had grown up, and seen the lies for what they were, and then seen them again, and realized they had not been lies at all. They had been love. They had been life. The applause afterward was thunderous. But Guido barely heard it. He was looking at Josu. After the show, backstage, as everyone embraced and wept and packed up the props for what would be the last time, Guido took the original recording of Ezra's violin from its place in the trunk. He handed it to his son. "It's yours now," he said. Josu didn't reply. He just hugged him. The troupe disbanded formally that winter. Some stayed in Rome. Others went abroad. Josu published a memoir entitled The Invisible Game, chronicling not just his father's journey, but those of dozens of others who had lived because someone told them a story, instead of letting them fall. The book was banned in 2 countries. It was translated into 18 languages. In Berlin, Someone scrawled a tank with wings on the wall outside a newly built Holocaust education center. Guido lived for another 5 years. He spent most of them in a small apartment overlooking a quiet alley where cats chased pigeons and old women shouted from their balconies. He told jokes to the grocer. He cooked elaborate meals with Dora that always included too much butter. He played chess with Josu on Sundays, always losing on purpose, even when he didn't have to. When he died, it was in his sleep, holding Dora's hand, a smile on his lips, as if he'd heard the sound of children laughing in his dreams. At his funeral, hundreds came. Not just friends or fellow performers, but strangers who had seen the troupe decades earlier. Some brought red balloons. Some brought apples. One brought a puppet shaped like a giraffe. As they lowered his casket into the earth, Josu stepped forward and placed the old recording on top. Then he spoke. My father fought in the war. He never held a gun. He never punched a man. He never ordered anyone to charge or flee or hold. He told jokes. He made a child believe that horror was a game. And because of that, I'm here. And because of that, so are many others. Laughter, he said, can be resistance. That, and then he stepped back. And the wind carried the music from a small player nearby Ezra's violin. Still crackling, still imperfect, still impossibly alive. The years after Guido's funeral unfolded, not with the urgency of war or the fire of resistance, but with the quiet, persistent rhythm of life rebuilding itself. Rome continued to breathe its ancient breath, a city where every stone carried centuries of joy and grief, and where Guido's story slowly moved from the whisper of a memory into something far more lasting. Josu remained in the city after the burial, living in the small apartment his father had once called home, surrounded by crates of paper and photographs, theater props, postcards from the road, and the heavy silence left by a voice that had always filled every room. But even in the quiet, Guido remained present. At first, Josu tried to move forward by working quietly. He catalogued his father's letters, translated the troupe's old scripts into digital formats, and began archiving the names of all those they had saved or reunited. He created what would eventually be known as the Invisible Archive, an online repository that grew slowly at first and then rapidly, as survivors or their children from across continents began to reach out. Each entry was a story. Some were as brief as a single line. I remember the red balloon. Others spanned pages, filled with the names of forgotten relatives, with the secrets whispered behind burning buildings, with the echo of jokes told to delay death. Among those who wrote was a woman in Ukraine who had been smuggled out of a camp inside a crate of stolen stage costumes. There was a man in Canada who remembered Guido handing him a boiled potato wrapped in cloth and calling it a sacred treasure passed down from the Queen of Sardinia. There were letters from Argentina, Poland, South Africa, even Japan. Each story came like a wave, each one revealing that the performance had not ended on any stage but had lived on, multiplying inside the hearts of those who had once been children. In the shadows, in time, museums began to take notice. A curator from Yad Vashem reached out, requesting access to the archive. Then the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Then private universities. But Josu didn't want the story to become a dry academic record. He feared it would be reduced to footnotes and filed away in the back corners of education, another artifact too brittle to matter. So he proposed something different. He called it La Memoria Viventi, the Living Memory Project, a traveling experience, part theater, part museum, part interactive archive. It would invite audiences, not just to learn, but to feel. The first exhibition opened in a converted train station in Bologna, with the old curtains of Gli Invisibili hanging from repurposed iron beams, and music playing from hidden speakers, faint and broken, just enough to make one stop and listen. The centerpiece was a room, called the Game. It was built for children. They entered through a doorway shaped like a stage curtain, and were handed a card with their name and a secret number. Inside, they were asked to complete small tasks, like folding a paper star or memorizing a funny song. They were told they were part of a secret mission that the adults couldn't know, and that each point earned brought them closer to a mysterious prize. The tasks were absurd. Draw a smile on a potato, tell a joke to a stranger, imitate the sound of a chicken trying to speak French. But there was a point. At the end, the children were gathered and told the truth, not about death or atrocity, not directly. They were told about a man who had once saved a child by pretending that horror was a game. They were told that imagination could be armor, that laughter could be a bridge over despair. Some of them cried. Some asked questions their parents weren't ready to answer. And all of them remembered. The exhibit traveled for 5 years. Joe went with it, at first as its curator, then as its voice. In cities where language failed him, he would show them a photograph of his father in his waiter uniform, standing beside a chalkboard that read, "Today's Special, Life." He would hold up the red balloon. He would play the old violin recording. He never gave a speech. He just let the silence fill the space, and then waited for someone to laugh. Eventually, Josu returned to the camp. He went alone. The camp was now a museum, preserved like an insect in amber, with signs and railings and guided tours offered in 5 languages. The barracks still stood, hollow and skeletal. The yard where Guido had danced in his final act of mischief was empty, the gravel now covered with weeds that dared to grow. Josu walked the ground slowly, stopping at the broom closet where he had once hidden, where the air had tasted of rust and fear. He opened the door and stepped inside. It was barely large enough for a boy, but in the shadows, he saw it as it had been. The quiet, the trembling, the voice whispering outside that it was all just a test, that the game would end soon. He sat down, knees pressed to his chest, and closed his eyes. He stayed there for over an hour. When he emerged, the sky was the same dull gray it had always been, and the wind bit his cheeks, but he felt no weight. He stood in the middle of the yard, where he had once seen the tank roll in, where he had once believed. And this time, for the first time as a man, he truly saw what his father had done, not lead, not tricked. He had kept a light burning when everything else had gone dark. That night, in the small hotel outside the campgrounds, Josu wrote a letter to Dora, who now lived in the countryside north of Florence, surrounded by flowers and chickens and paintings of skies that had never known war. He told her he was ready. The next spring, Josu opened a school. It was not a normal school. It had no tests, no grades, no traditional curriculum. It was called Scuola de School of the Impossible, and its goal was simple: to teach children how to tell stories that saved lives. Classes included laughter, therapy, memory weaving, resistance theater, empathy through fiction, and one special unit called Games for Survival. No child left without understanding the power of absurdity in the face of cruelty. No child left without knowing the name Guido. Teachers came from across the world. Survivors volunteered. Students created plays that were performed in refugee centers, hospitals, detention camps, anywhere despair might be hiding. The school became a model, then a movement. Across Europe, small versions of it emerged, named after different resistance figures, all inspired by the idea that survival was more than staying alive. It was staying human. When Dora passed away, she was buried beside Guido, beneath a simple stone marked only with their names. 2 small masks carved between them, one smiling, one weeping. Josu stood at the grave with his wife and their daughter, a precocious 7-year-old named Miriam, who insisted on wearing a red cape that day because she wanted to look like a flying tank. He looked at the stone and whispered, "Thank you." Then he turned to his daughter and asked if she wanted to hear a story. She nodded. And so he began. "Once," he said, "there was a man who walked through a world made of shadows. But he carried a joke, so big it lit the sky. And he gave that joke to his son. And now the son gives it to you." Miriam laughed, and in that laugh, somewhere deep, far beyond time, Guido laughed, too. And the world for a moment was beautiful again. The spring air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms through the Florence hillside cemetery as the small gathering lingered in quiet conversation after the funeral. But Josu stood apart, his eyes tracing the names on the stone, remembering how many times he had returned here, not just in footsteps, but in dreams. The masks carved between the names of his parents seemed to shift slightly in the shadow of the late afternoon sun. The smiling one forever tipped a bit higher. He imagined his father would have wanted it that way. That night, as they returned to the family house, now partially converted into a retreat for visiting storytellers and artists in residence, Miriam asked if she could sleep in Nona Dora's old room. Josu smiled and helped her carry her favorite books inside. The room still smelled faintly of oils and brush cleaner. On the walls hung paintings his mother had created over the years, skies she'd never seen, stars that didn't belong to any one hemisphere, and always, figures dancing in silhouette, reaching for each other across oceans of gold or crimson, while Miriam slept under the watchful eye of a painted sky. Josu stayed in the kitchen, sifting through old boxes he hadn't opened in years. Among them was a faded notebook labeled only with a drawing, a red balloon tied to a violin bow. Inside were sketches, notes, and early ideas for the school of the impossible, many of them written in his father's hand. Others added by Dora over time. Some pages were pure nonsense. Others were raw emotional blueprints for the work they'd done together. One page caught his Aja map, drawn in crayon by a much younger Josu, marked with fictional cities and game levels, each one labeled with points and a hand-drawn tank beside the finish line. He traced the lines with his finger and thought again about how close they had all come to vanishing, and how deeply they still lived, in ink and laughter, in stories retold by children who never knew the war. In the performances now being reenacted by other groups, using the old scripts and adapting them for new horrors, new prisons, new exiles. That summer, Josu was invited to speak at a global conference in Oslo, focused on generational trauma and healing through storytelling. He brought Miriam with him. She insisted on wearing her red cape again. On the second day, after an emotionally wrenching panel on displaced youth from modern conflict zones, Josu was approached by a man in a gray sweater with bright, searching eyes. The man introduced himself as Yed. He was a playwright from Ethiopia and had seen one of Glee Invisibly's traveling shows as a child when it came through a refugee camp outside of Asmara. He remembered Guido, not his name, but the ridiculous mustache, the exaggerated bow, the banana peel trick, that had made the entire camp erupt in laughter. He told Josu that he had spent most of his life writing plays about memory and resistance. He said he never forgot that moment of absurd joy. Yard asked permission to adapt the troupe's early work into something new, something hybrid, African folktale, part Holocaust memory, part modern migration myth. He wanted to call it The Last Balloon. Josu moved beyond words, gave him everything he needed: the scripts, the music, the recordings, and most of all, the blessing. In the years that followed, these adaptations spread. In Brazil, a performance reimagined Guido as a capoeira teacher in a Rio favela, using dance and humor to protect children from being recruited by gangs. In Istanbul, he became a shadow puppet, dancing through the ruins of empires, reminding children of joy's defiance. In Seoul, he was reborn in a VR experience where players solved riddles to rescue memories trapped inside a digital camp, using empathy as currency. Through it all, Miriam grew. She was not like her father or grandfather. Her humor was subtler, more sly, but her questions were endless and her gaze sharp as a scalpel. At 11, she asked why grown-ups always talked about the past when the present was still bleeding. At 12, she founded a digital zine with her friends from the school, called Game Over Is Not the End, where they published illustrated short stories about what it meant to win the unwinnable. At 14, she asked to accompany her father to Poland, to the ruins of Belzec, where new testimonies were being digitized and archived. They stood together among the stones, the wind whipping around them, and Josu found himself repeating words he'd once heard Guido say. That memory wasn't a burden, it was a gift. A kind of map, handed down so that those who came next could know which roads to avoid, which lies to see through, and where to dig for the truth when the surface had been covered in silence. On the flight back to Italy, Miriam slept on his shoulder, and Josu looked out at the clouds below and felt his father there, somewhere between sky and silence. When she turned 16, Miriam wrote and directed her first short film. It was animated with paper cutouts and old-school stop-motion. The story followed a young boy named Leo who discovered that his grandfather's bedtime stories were actually encoded resistance missions. Each episode of the so-called game had been real, reimagined through a lens of absurd whimsy. The climax revealed that Leo's grandfather had used humor not to lie but to arm him with courage. The film, titled Leo's Game, won a youth film festival in Munich and was translated into 10 languages within 6 months. At the premiere screening, a woman with a faded number tattooed on her arm approached Miriam and kissed her hand. She said, with a quivering smile, that she had once been saved by a man who danced in the shadow of a furnace. He had slipped her a hard candy and told her it was a crystal that could make nightmares melt. She had kept it for decades. Later, Miriam would write about that moment in her journal. She didn't tell her father, but she kept the story close. As Josu aged, he stepped back from public life. He spent more time teaching at the school, focusing on his students' projects, and mentoring young educators in how to use laughter without cruelty and empathy without performance. He refused all offers to have a biopic made about his father. He said real heroes didn't need scripts, they needed voices. When he was 68, he began recording a podcast with Miriam. They called it Level 1. Each episode featured the story of a child who had survived or changed their world in small, absurd, powerful ways. They included letters from Gaza, diary entries from Siberia, and even fictional tales that contained truths too dangerous to name outright. The podcast grew a quiet but devoted following. In one particularly moving episode, they replayed the original recording of Ezra's violin, followed by a compilation of voices: Guido's laugh, Dora's stories, and new laughter from all over the globe. Miriam took over the school not long after. She transformed it, expanded it, made it borderless. With the help of educators and artists around the world, she created satellite programs in conflict zones, rebuilt cultural centers in refugee camps, and developed a curriculum on radical joy as an act of resistance. She partnered with psychologists, artists, architects. Her work wasn't just about healing the past anymore. It was about arming the future. On the centennial of Guido's birth, a bronze sculpture was unveiled in the heart of Arezzi Zio. It showed a man holding a child on one shoulder, both laughing, both pointing towards something unseen on the horizon. Around the base, etched in 12 languages, were the words, "Sometimes, to survive, you have to play the most impossible game." At the ceremony, Miriam stood before the crowd and told one final story. It was about a man who carried joy like a weapon, who danced in front of monsters so that a child could believe the world was kind. She didn't use his name. She didn't need to. The audience wept, and then they laughed. And somewhere, across memory, across time, across everything that tried to end him, Guido smiled once more. Years passed, like pages turned by an unseen wind, each carrying stories that folded into the next. The sculpture in Arezzo became more than a memorial. It became a pilgrimage site. Children on school trips were guided to it by teachers holding worn copies of The Invisible Game. Parents brought their kids and whispered half-remembered legends. And older survivors, some in wheelchairs, some still walking with pride, came to leave red balloons, or old photos, or folded paper stars beneath the bronze feet of the man and the child. But the world, as always, moved forward unevenly. Wars did not stop. Exile did not vanish. Hatred wore new uniforms. Yet, amid it all, the ideas that Guido had carried, unofficial, unsanctioned, wildly human, had taken root in more places than anyone could have imagined. His story, once barely known beyond a handful of survivors and theatergoers, had become a compass for educators, activists, artists, and even mental health workers, trying to reach children whose innocence had been torn away by violence. Miriam, now a woman of 36, had long since stepped into her own light. She no longer wore the red cape, but it still hung in her office, folded neatly in a glass case. Her programs had expanded into digital worlds. One of her latest initiatives, titled Operation Make Believe, used augmented reality to bring children in war-torn regions into playful storyscapes where they could rewrite endings, become heroes, and experience empowerment through fantasy. It was backed by psychologists, funded by unlikely allies, and monitored carefully to ensure safety and healing. What many dismissed as just games were in fact intricate therapeutic experiences, drawn from the roots of Guido's invented game for Josu. In an interview with a London journalist, Miriam was asked why she believed fantasy was still needed in an age where technology could deliver hard truth instantly. She paused, her voice soft but clear, and said, "Because truth without imagination becomes unbearable. My grandfather taught us to carry truth like a song, light enough to lift, but strong enough to last." Meanwhile, the School of the Impossible had transformed into something beyond anyone's expectations. Its original campus in Florence had expanded, with a performance hall, to digital production studios, and an underground archive housing thousands of letters, objects, recordings, and testimonies, each donated by someone touched by glee. It was no longer only a school, it was a sanctuary. Former child soldiers now taught creative writing. Refugee poets led classes on metaphor and belonging. Street performers who once juggled on broken sidewalks now taught stage presence as a survival skill. And in one quiet wing of the school, Josu kept working. Now an older man, he walked slowly but steadily, his beard silver, his fingers calloused from years of handling fragile paper and even more fragile memories. He taught only one class, now held every Friday, called Simply Remembering. No grades, no homework, just students, often seated on the floor, listening to a man who had once hidden in a broom closet, while his father turned tell into a game. His stories didn't come with morals or clean endings. Sometimes they were funny, sometimes heartbreaking. Once, a student asked him what was the hardest thing he'd ever had to forget. He shook his head and said, "I never forgot anything. That's how I survived. That's how I keep him alive. One autumn evening, Miriam asked him to record an oral history, not just for the archive, but for a documentary she was co-producing with a group of independent filmmakers based in Tel Aviv, Berlin, and Buenos Aires. It would be called The Joke That Saved Us. They sat in a sunlit room with microphones and Tijosu at first hesitated. But then, slowly, he began. He spoke for hours, about the jokes, the hiding, the hunger, the day the tank arrived, about the silence afterward, and the way his father's absence had once felt louder than bombs. He talked about the first time he saw Dora smile again, about how it had taken years for him to understand what had really happened, not just the war, but the layers of love hidden in every absurd story his father had told. And then he said something that would stay with the filmmakers forever. Father didn't just resist. He rewrote the rules of resistance. He showed that joy, sincere, stubborn joy, was the most terrifying thing to those who wanted us to vanish. The documentary won awards. But more importantly, it was shown in schools. It was used in training programs for therapists and humanitarian workers. It even reached a prison system in Chile, where inmates watched the reenactments in stunned silence. And one man wrote a letter saying, "For the first time, I see that I am not too broken to carry something beautiful." That winter, Josu grew ill. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, slow way that life starts folding its coat for the journey home. Miriam visited daily. They read together, watched old performances, sometimes laughing, sometimes falling silent mid-sentence. Once, during a particularly cold evening, she found him staring out the window. "Do you ever think about him?" she asked. "Every day," he answered. "Sometimes in my dreams, he still tells me I'm close to winning the game." "And, are you?" He smiled, turned his face back to the window, and whispered, "I think the prize is just remembering how to play." He passed away 2 months later, in the same home he had grown up in. Miriam was at his side. She didn't cry right away. Instead, she pulled the red cape from its case, folded it into a small square, and placed it beside his chest. She whispered, "You win, Papa, you win." The funeral was simple. Hundreds came. Some flew across oceans to attend. One by one, people stood and told stories not of the man who resisted, but of the man who remembered, of the man who turned fear into theater, silence into music, and pain into a path others could walk without shame. A month later, a new room was added to the School of the Impossible. It was called the Room of Echoes. It held no screens, no plaques, no artifacts, just soft lights, comfortable seating, and a quiet recording playing over hidden speakers. Guido's voice, restored from the earliest tapes, telling the story of the invisible kangaroo who won the bicycle race. The children didn't always understand it, but they laughed. And outside the school gates, a new mural had been painted, this time by a group of Syrian refugee teenagers, working with local Italian artists. It depicted a clown holding a lantern, guiding a line of children across a tightrope stretched between two ruined towers. Above them, a balloon floated, red and bright, tethered not by string, but by a golden thread of music. Miriam stood before it one evening, alone. Long after everyone had left, she placed her hand on the painted wall and closed her eyes. And in the quiet, she heard the same sound her grandfather had once heard in the darkest hour. The sound of a child laughing in the dark. And she smiled, because beauty, like memory, never dies. It only hides, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it back into the light.